Hey folks, Eddie from Totally Wired Guitars here, and today we are going to be taking a look at this heavily customized 60th anniversary Fender Jaguar. Now, obviously, this one is not your standard 60th anniversary Jaguar, and I'm excited to get into this with you all in a bit. But first, let's just talk about the 60th anniversary Jaguar in general. So, the Jaguar, as many of you folks know, was released back in 1962, and 2022 was the year where Fender commemorated its 60th anniversary. For that special occasion, they released two of these 60th anniversary Jaguar models, one in Mystic Lake Placid Blue, which this one used to be, as well as a Mystic Dakota Red model. I'm not sure what the Mystic part of the name really makes reference to, aside from I did notice that as compared to the standard Lake Placid Blue and Dakota Red, both of these Mystic variants were darker as well as more sparkly, almost like a light sparkle kind of finish as compared to just the standard metallic on the Lake Placid Blue and also the solid color of Dakota Red. Now, moving on to the specs, this model came with an alder body as well as a full C profile maple neck. Originally, the whole thing was a gloss nitrocellulose lacquer. It also featured a round laminated 7.25-inch fretboard with binding as well as late 60s style perloid block inlays. This also featured a bone nut as well as vintage tall frets instead of the typical vintage frets. I'm not quite sure why they made that decision, but I have been seeing it on a lot of Fender models since 2020, starting with the American Original 60s. And yeah, some people are okay with these frets. Some people hate them. They basically are vintage size frets in their width, but as far as their height, they are more akin to your medium jumbo style frets. On the back of the neck, you can see that this model also came with the Fender F-stamp tuner, which until about 2020 had been produced in Germany. These more modern ones are made in Taiwan, most likely by the Ping company, which makes most of Fender's classic vintage style tuners. They are pretty good quality, and believe it or not, these Taiwan made F tuners are actually a lot more smooth to operate as compared to the older German ones, which I feel like folks have griped about in the past as just being like, you know, kind of janky feeling in general, and I can concur when I have tried those out on models such as the 72 Custom Telecaster. Moving on to what was featured on this guitar hardware-wise, it came with your typical American vintage reissue style locking tremolo unit, as well as a mute, which we do not have on this one because this one has been fitted with a mastery bridge. In case you don't know, the mastery bridge posts or legs are a little bit too large to fit a Fender mute without modification to the mute plate. So I decided to skip the mute on this one. Under the hood, this came with Fender Pure Vintage 65 pickups, despite the copy where they said that a special set of custom design Jaguar pickups were put into this model. And then the rest of the electronics is your standard American spec Jaguar fare. You've got your cloth covered wiring, as well as your full-size CTS pots and mini pots in the rhythm circuit, your switchcraft switches, input jack, as well as your standard AVRI roller knobs. The guitar did come fully shielded with the brass shielding plates underneath the pickups, as well as in all of the various control routes. And it also features the aluminum pickguard shield to help block out 60 cycle hum as well as other electronic interference. Now, this one weighs a little bit under 8 pounds, which is fantastic because most of the ones that I have tried and serviced over the years have been closer to 9 pounds. So it's nice to actually get a light one. While these weren't a proper late 60s or like 66 reissue by Fender USA, these did feature the original threaded saddle bridge to commemorate the fact that this was an anniversary model. So every now and again, outside of custom builds, clients will come to me asking to have their guitars refinished. I have been working on the past few projects with Bloom Doom guitars, so shout outs to Caleb as well as Dustin at Bloom Doom Guitars, who did a fantastic job refinishing this one in a beautiful relic charcoal frost metallic. It is a really thin, gorgeous nitro finish. It's got, if you can see there, some weather checking as well as little dings and just natural, tasteful wear. Moving on to the back of the guitar, we have some more of that gorgeous vintage style relic detail. We've got an aged neck plate, and by request, the guys at Bloom Doom also knocked back that gloss lacquer finish for a more vintage style satiny worn in feel to it, which for me makes this neck that much more playable and comfortable. It's funny when I talk about guitars because for me, the heart and soul of most guitars is their necks, and the neck on the 60th anniversary is a really fantastic one. Folks who are looking for a thinner neck, such as those that were found on actual vintage early 60s models, or even the American Vintage Reissue 62 model, might not get along with this full chunky C neck. I have seen on the forum some folks complaining and wondering why Fender at a certain point started making all of their US produced Jaguars with such chunky necks. And I'm not quite sure why that is. I'm hoping still, with my fingers crossed, that at some point this year in 2025, we will get to see a proper AV2 1966 reissue Jaguar with the actual proper larger block inlay size. I'm not sure why they decided to do this. This is the same thing that they did to the Troy Van Leeuwen Jazzmaster. Put your tinfoil hats on, but some folks were musing that perhaps this kind of move was to push people into commissioning builds from the custom shop if they wanted the proper vintage style specs. But I'm not quite sure if Fender just got lazy or maybe they were trying to distinguish between this and planned models that they were going to do. So, yeah, who knows? That said, I still think it looks really, really sharp and definitely gives a nice nod to those later 60s Jaguars. Continuing on the neck, as I had just mentioned, this is a fairly chunky neck. It really does remind me a lot of the American Vintage 65 necks, or even those on the American Original 60s, both of which were also quite chunky. The vintage tall frets actually don't bother me too much. When I measure, they are just thousandths of an inch taller than your typical vintage size fret. So if anything, I feel like you can play with a little bit less of a death grip, if you will, and play with a bit of a lighter touch as well on these vintage tall frets. And yeah, overall, even though I would prefer vintage frets, I think that these are totally fine, and most folks are probably not going to notice that huge of a difference. Now, let's talk about a couple of the other modifications and upgrades that this Jaguar got. So we did away with those pure vintage 65 pickups. Just as a quick comment, they used to be a really fantastic value, especially at the, $120 price point that they had been for a very, very long time. In the past year or so, Fender marked these pickups up to about 150, which brings you into, custom made Jaguar pickup territory. Because the pure vintage 65 Jaguar pickups are pretty underwound. They are in the 6 to 6.25K output range. They do tend to be bright, a little bit sterile, and lacking in the character department for me personally, but most folks, I think, will find them to be just fine. I ended up upgrading the pickups in these to EP Customs vintage style Jaguar pickups. These ones are their plain enamel version, which I think do a really fantastic job of paying tribute to those later 60s style Jags. The slightly higher output of these pickups, I feel, do a better job at driving a tube amp such as the 65 Fender Princeton reissue, as well as dirt pedals, which, as you all probably know from my previous videos, I absolutely love my dirt pedals. So, yeah, I think that these just sound great. I think the added low end and mid frequencies to these pickups really give you a more full and robust Jaguar tone than the pure vintage 65s that came in this stock. My client who commissioned these mods, he actually already has a genuine 1962 vintage Jaguar, so he wanted to modernize the playability and feel a bit. And so, of course, we went ahead and installed the tried and true Mastery Bridge. It increases the sustain, also the fixed as opposed to rocking nature of the Mastery Bridge helps to solve some of the original issues with the original rocking bridge, such as your intonation going out if that rocking bridge decides to shift forward or backward, especially after using the tremolo. The Mastery Bridge's deeper grooves also help to solve the common issue of players knocking their strings out of those threaded saddles because those saddles don't actually have slots for the strings. These deeper grooves keep the strings in the saddles regardless of how hard you play, and it's next to impossible to knock them out. There's some debate from folks on the Mastery Bridge on everything from their aesthetics, which some folks hate because it just looks a little bit too modernized, to even the intonation issues that come with a Mastery Bridge, especially if you're using a wound G, due to the fact that it is, at the end of the day, actually just two saddles that have been compensated, and you can only compensate to a certain point before, folks with more specific needs, such as a wound G, will end up running into issues where you can't actually intonate that wound G that well. But for me personally, the Mastery has been a go-to that I have installed as an upgrade on my own personal guitars, as well as a common recommendation I give to clients, especially those who are actively gigging or recording artists, because it is just that kind of set and forget type of bridge. And the last detail that I wanted to go over is the custom cut mint green vintage celluloid style pickguard on this. It's got the wider beveled edge, which looks a lot more vintage than most modern reproduction Jaguar pickguards that you can get that are readily available and mass produced. And it's just a nice little detail that I feel enhances the overall vintage vibe of the guitar. As far as availability goes, yes, this is a pretty rare model. You are not going to see a ton of these on the used market, But when you do, they are going to be quite pricey because Fender only did this run for 1 year, and that was back in 2022. Because of their rarity, sellers who list these with their original case and case candy and are in excellent condition often list them for 2.8K and up. It's not uncommon to see these marked up to over 3K, but I would be guessing with the way that the used guitar market has been going, especially over the past year, that sellers most likely, if they're wanting to sell, will come down in price. So make sure to try to submit your best offers and negotiate with them, as I feel like these would be fantastic guitars if you can get them for, 2.5K or less. In summary, do I think the 60th anniversary Fender Jaguar, even in its stock form, is worth buying? I'd say yes. I think it's a cool late 60s style, American made, nitro finished Jaguar, especially because, again, Fender hasn't released a proper 1966 reissue. So if you need to buy one that is US made with that nitro finish, this is basically the only thing that is available outside of actual vintage as well as the custom shop. As an alternative, but also quite rare at this point, Fender Japan did release the traditional two late 60s Jaguars, which had a CBS headstock, which is not featured here, curiously, and also blocks and binding with the accurate larger block inlay sizes. But those ones came with basswood bodies, which for whatever reason is not for everyone, as well as a 9.5-inch radius, which again, some folks prefer the 7.25, and is only available in the polyurethane finish. So if you're wanting one of these, definitely keep an eye out, or maybe, just maybe, Fender will actually grace us with that 66 reissue that all Jaguar fans, especially those of the CBS era, deserve and has been a long time coming. So Fender, if you're watching, please release the damn AV2 Jaguar, please. Anyway, I think that about does it for this guitar. I hope you enjoyed it and found it informative, especially if you are on the hunt for the perfect Jaguar for you. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to be notified of my new videos as soon as they drop. And don't forget to follow Totally Wired Guitars for more offset guitars buying tips.